I think it makes sense to just what are your organization's values? And does a particular cause align with the values? Because if they do, then you have a defensible position. Certain things are pretty generic. I don't know anybody who's against poor environment, poor drinking water. But when we get into things like environmentalism, what part of that are you talking about? This really comes down to definition. Are you talking about recycling? Are you talking about supply chain, everywhere from where you get your raw materials to how you dispose of waste and manufacturing? What practices do you practice? If you're traveling for business, are you encouraging employees to take the most environmentally friendly way to get to their destination? So it has a multiple of layers in each one of these environmental, social, and governance areas. And you have to pick something or multiple things that align with your business.
Welcome to On Record PR, where we go on record with industry leaders to discuss best practices for public relations strategies that drive business success. Let's get started with the show.
Welcome to On Record PR. I'm your host, Gina Rubel. Today, I'm going on record with Gregg Feistman, Assistant Chair of Public Relations at Temple University. After a long career in corporate public relations, Gregg celebrates his 22nd year in this role. He oversees the undergraduate PR program and teaches graduate courses in corporate social responsibility and consulting skills. Something we all need, right, Gregg?
Well, absolutely.
He and two colleagues recently presented a study on emerging technology and PR at this year's Institute for Public Relations conference in Washington, D.C. He's a local and national speaker, a published novelist, and is currently co-writing a book on corporate social advocacy. I'd be remiss if I didn't say I've known Gregg for, I think we're going on 3 decades. I'm thrilled to have you on the show today, Gregg, and I'd love to welcome you to our On Record PR listeners.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Gina.
So let's get right into the show. How do CEOs and leaders deal with the call for greater social advocacy and activism?
Yeah, it's an interesting C-suite dilemma. And just to give you a little context, a little history, we really saw the rise of this within the last 10 years with initially #MeToo movement, certainly the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, the rise of anti-Semitism. And what has been happening in the corporate world is that they're under greater scrutiny than ever before. And various stakeholders are demanding they respond to some of these issues and really want to know, what stance do you take on this issue? And not taking a stance is an answer, but you better have a reason why you're not taking a stance on it as well. And we're seeing the pressure from various stakeholders, including the investor market, but employees, customers, suppliers. It really runs the gamut of the ecosystem that corporations are existing in.
I think it's fascinating because, as a former litigator and one, as you know, who works predominantly with law firms and legal issues, my gut says to ask, well, should every type of company take a stance on everything?
Obviously, nobody can take a stance on everything. First of all, things are moving so fast. I mean, the news today is going to be different than the news tomorrow. And I think it makes sense to just, what are your organization's values? And does a particular cause align with the values? Because if they do, then you have a defensible position. Certain things are pretty generic. I don't know anybody who's against poor environment, poor drinking water. But when we get into things like environmentalism, what part of that are you talking about? This really comes down to definition. Are you talking about recycling? Are you talking about supply chain, everywhere from where you get your raw materials to how you dispose of waste and manufacturing? What practices do you practice? If you're traveling for business, are you encouraging employees to take the most environmentally friendly way to get to their destination? So it has a multiple of layers in each one of these environmental, social, and governance areas. And you have to pick something or multiple things that align with your business. Otherwise, we're all for world peace, but, who knows that we're ever going to get there.
So you mentioned environmental, social, and governance. Let's talk about ESG for just a second. What is it and how does it fit into the social advocacy and activism sphere?
Right. Well, it's a great question. It's another term for what was once known as corporate social responsibility. And depending on who you talk to, it's the same thing, just with a different label. But it stands for environmental, social, and governance. So the environmental part is the one, probably the one that's easiest to understand. The social aspect is a little bit harder to define because, again, what part of social justice are you talking about? Are you talking about racial equity? Are you talking about pay equity, gender equity? What part of it makes sense for you to support? And again, none of these things are necessarily bad causes, but I think what organizations have to do, first of all, is do an internal gut check, do a little navel gazing. Where are you now on things such as gender equity or pay equity or women's health care? What is your position now? What are your policies? Could they stand to be improved? Go out and listen to your stakeholders. What do they expect of you? And of course, we both know employees are your most important stakeholders, but I think even shareholders are starting to get a little more savvy on some of this stuff. Are you holding your vendors accountable, your suppliers accountable to some of your standards? What are your standards? And then when it comes to governance, again, what are your governance standards? What's your competition doing? What are other companies doing? Internationally, for example, in India, they've had, for a number of years, a law that says 2% of their profits, of companies' profits, must go towards what was then CSR programs. So it's been an interesting experiment. A lot of organizations globally are watching it, but this is, first of its kind. It's mandated by the government. You must devote 2% of your profit to social issues.
So I want to just mention this for our listeners. If you're not familiar with the term ESG, go to the URL esgthereport.com. I think it'll be really helpful to understand what the Sustainable Development Goals are and how they play into this idea of ESG. As an example, there's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. One is zero hunger in the world, and another is life on land versus another life below water. And the reason I bring that up in terms of this conversation is when we are talking about social advocacy, it's my understanding that you have to pick where you want to spend your time as a company. Is that correct?
I think so. Nobody has resources for everything. So what makes sense that aligns with your business or aligns with your industry? So, for example, in New Jersey, there is a movement to grow the wind power industry. That has all kinds of environmental and social and governance issues, from pollution to underwater noise to some people are very much against it because they're going to spoil the visuals off the coast. But then you get into, what is this really? It's the energy industry. So you have that layer on top of it. How are you going to, this is a way to be sustainable in an energy infrastructure, but what's it going to take to do that, to get there? There are just so many layers, and that's so true for many, many, many industries.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because as the owner of a home in Cape May, New Jersey, where, along the coast there, I'm sure you've read the stories about dolphins washing up on the beach, and everybody is blaming windmills. And it's my understanding that there's not actually evidence of that. However, then the question becomes, like, when you talk about ESG and what you get behind, those are the types of causes that some companies need to get behind. But individuals, listeners also need to understand how they're investing their money, right?
Absolutely.
So if you're investing in those same companies.
Well, it's not only those same companies, but there are ETFs and mutual funds that are social choice, for want of a better word. And over the last several years, the data shows these have very good returns.
Oh, yeah.
They're designed to invest in corporations that have very solid, ongoing sustainability efforts. And sustainability is really the key, because every business wants to be sustainable. Of course, you don't want to disappear in, 5 years. I mean, who knows anybody remember MySpace?
Unfortunately, yes.
And who's going to know what's going to happen with Twitter? But the S, the social part, the environmental part, the governance part, these are all things that lead to sustainable business practices. So from a dollar and cents point of view, to me, it just makes, forgive the pun, sense to invest in these kinds of programs, whether you are an individual or institutional investor or you're in the C-suite, because it's going to lead to more sustainable business. And on another level, you're going to attract talent. We're already seeing the Gen Zs and the people coming out of colleges, they have a choice of where they want to work. And they're very socially conscious. As a college instructor, I can tell you this for a fact. And if their values don't align with the business's values, they don't have to work there. And it might be a candidate you really want in your company, but your values don't align with theirs, so they're going to go elsewhere. So it's also a recruiting tool.
Absolutely. It's, it falls under the compass of moral, ethical, recruiting, good business, all of those things.
Of course.
So how do you balance competing stakeholder interests?
That's the trick, Gina. That is the trick, because you, in almost any issue, you are going to have competing stakeholder interests. So this is where it gets tricky, because on one issue this morning, you might go with stakeholder A. On the issue that comes up this afternoon, you might go with stakeholder B. You have to first establish really good relationships with your various stakeholders and understand what is important to them. Then how do your own stated values align with that? People are going to make mistakes. It happens. We've seen that, over the years. But, a great example is right now what's going on with Disney and the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, about the, quote, don't say gay bill, unquote, where Disney, under Bob Iger, who was not always an advocate, he was very much the old school, business is about business, we don't get involved in social issues, until this started impacting Disney. And it really grew from employee pressure. And it also helped cost the then CEO of Disney their job. And then Bob Iger stepped in, and he really has become very much an activist, even going past advocacy, about this, to the point where in this war with the governor, Disney has canceled economic development in Orlando and is moving that money to California.
I read that recently, and I can say that is a company living its standards.
Absolutely.
And I think our listeners know me well enough to know that I stand behind Disney on that one.
Yeah. And, again, and Bob Iger's not doing this out of altruism. He understands that standing up for LGBTQ rights, A, appeals to a section of stakeholders within his employee base, but also to outside. Because again, ultimately, we all vote with our wallets. And if the values don't align with my values, I'm not going to support you. It's that simple. Or I may not vote for you, or whatever, the action is that we all can take. But it's been really interesting to watch that war of words going on. And now, of course, it's entered the legal arena because there are competing lawsuits. And who knows but what's interesting is the business community is questioning why the governor is pushing this. Disney is the largest employer in the state. Mm-hmm.
We could do a whole podcast on that issue. I think it's a great example of social advocacy and activism. And whether or not you call it moral or business acumen or whatever you want to call it, he still has to stand up to something that there is a faction of the community that thinks is right. So I venture to believe that there's more people that think it's wrong. But I'm not going to get onto my moral soapbox here.
And the problem is these days, everything is viewed through the polarization of politics.
Yeah.
And that's not going away.
Well, let me ask you this. Is there a way, so when we talk about stakeholder interests, is there a way to test for stakeholder interests? Is there, how we have the DISC profiles or the Gallup profiles? How do you figure out what a stakeholder's interests are besides asking them?
Exactly. Ask them. They'll tell, people will be happy to give you their point of view on any topic. Ask them. Not only ask them, monitor their behaviors. Okay. Are their actions following their rhetoric? If they say, I won't buy from you if you support X, well, are you seeing a drop off in sales, or are they just, they'll still buy. They don't like you, but they still buy from you. I mean, I personally have a love-hate relationship with Amazon for that very reason.
Right.
I don't agree with all their policies. Am I still a customer? Yes. Is that hypocrisy? Perhaps, but we all have to make our own moral judgments. But yes, ask them and monitor their behaviors. That's how to find out. And the advantage of doing that is you preempt a potential crisis. Don't let it rise to the point where you have people, employees or others picketing outside your headquarters. If you monitor this on a regular basis, you can head off some of that. And even if there's controversy, bring some of these stakeholders in, sit down and talk with them. Understand, why is this important to you? How are you viewing us on this? Because maybe the message is garbled. Maybe you're believing social media posts instead of checking out what we're really doing. Have that dialogue. I mean, that is, again, Gina, you and I know that is true public relations.
Oh, I know. Part of it is also in the avoiding the issues in the long run is really having an understanding of who those stakeholders are in the beginning.
Absolutely.
So I agree wholeheartedly. So when do you take a stance and what do you have to consider when a company does so?
It's a good question. I think, again, you come back to the own organization's own values. What do you really believe in? And, you're going to put your money where your mouth is. And there are times, yes, it will cost you money. Dick's Sporting Goods back in 2012, the then CEO was so shaken by the Parkland high school shootings, he decided we're not selling guns anymore or ammo. And the critics and Wall Street all warned him, it's going to cost you a ton of money. And it did, because a year after that decision, they lost $150 million. And he publicly came out and said, there's some things more important than money. I'm paraphrasing. So that's another example of somebody who really stands up to their value. And to this day, they don't sell guns and ammo. But you're going to probably offend some group of stakeholders. You have to be willing to take that risk. Even if there's a financial penalty, there's a trend of boycotts, but research shows most boycotts don't last. There's a lot of noise, but shortly after they just kind of pass and business kind of returns to normal. I think the exception to that is what we're seeing with the momentum right now against Bud Light. That seems to have some legs. But the irony from a business point of view is Bud Light used to be the number one seller in beer, and now it's Modelo. And Modelo are owned by the same people. So you're really not hurting anybody.
That's interesting. And that's where I think all of those boycotts and things, they don't go deep enough to understand it's not just a product.
Well,
again, there's so many things that go into that product.
Right.
There's the real corporate owner.
Right.
And then there's the investments. I always go back to this idea of sustainable investing, because people might not buy something, but they never look at their portfolio to see if they're actually investing in that company to begin with.
Well, another example is the BP oil spill when the rig blew up and everybody wanted to boycott BP. The problem is you're not going to buy BP gas. The person you're hurting is the person who runs the gas station, because there's very little profit in gasoline. The profit comes from the stuff they sell inside the store. So what you're really hurting is a small business person. If you want to make your point known to BP, sell your shares.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And again, 100 shares isn't going to get their attention. But if institutional investors band together and start selling hundreds of thousands or millions of shares, BP will notice. Trust me.
Yeah, right. They will. It's a good point.
Yeah.
With that, we are going to pause for a message from our sponsor.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications. Recognized as the #1 agency by the National Law Journal, Furia Rubel helps top businesses and law firms with high-stakes public relations and marketing, reputation management, crisis planning, and incident response, including high-profile litigation media relations. To learn more, go to furiarubel.com or email podcast@furiarubel.com.
So what are the benefits and risks of a corporate social advocacy program?
Well, again, I think the benefits come down to image, reputation, enhancing your values. The benefits can be greater employee retention and recruitment, customer loyalty, new customer business development, There's a number of benefits to this. The risk, yes, you're going to probably offend somebody. And you have to determine if that, business is all about risk and reward. So you have to determine, are you willing to take that risk? And yes, it might cost you some money in the short term, but, why do you exist other than making a profit? And the public perception is we're giving you a license to operate your business, but what are you doing to enhance the quality of life? What's the return on investment over and above the dollars? Especially, again, as we get into an era of hyper-political partisanship, the wealth gap has been growing over the last couple of decades. What are you doing to help people who are part of your community, whether it is the physical community, a virtual community, the people who help support your business in every way possible, government, whatever. What are you doing to help? How are you making the world a better place? And I know that sounds very utopian, but in a real sense, that's what stakeholders are looking at now.
And we can make the world a better place.
Well, I think most business leaders want to do the right thing. They do. And part of what's been happening over the last several years is, how do I do it? It's not what I say or when do I say it. It's how do I do it? And that's where communicators, as communication counsel, along with other counsel, can help them.
And it's so interesting. It can start from anywhere. Just yesterday in our media market, I heard a story I think it was on Channel 6, about a boy in North Philadelphia who started his own water ice company at the age of 6. He's now 8, running this water ice company, but he's giving back to the community. So it's not just that he's selling water ice and making money. There's an activism part of it for an 8-year-old.
Well, again, I think the younger generations coming up are much more socially aware. And this is important to them. Again, as a college professor, I see it in both undergraduate and graduate students. This stuff's important. This is part of who they are. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them, that is one of their core values. And because they've seen, we are experiencing today, we experience the results, for example, of climate change. Okay. Storms are getting worse and lingering. Heat is, reaching record heats, cold. I mean, we're seeing the climate change. And, the younger people, this is the world they're going to be living in for the next 50 years and their kids, so yeah, it's important to them.
So big topic.
Yep.
Now moving into emerging technologies, how are things like large language models such as ChatGPT affecting the PR industry, and what are the legal and ethical issues?
Two really good questions. I think the first point I would make is for those who are interested in ChatGPT, which is just one example of generative AI, there are others out there, is understand it's just a tool. It's no different than email. It's no different than Google. It's a tool. Don't be afraid of it. First of all, it's not going away. Okay. I think it could be a very much a game changer in the next, for our profession in the next decade. And it's not perfect. It doesn't know anything past 2021.
Well, ChatGPT doesn't.
ChatGPT, I'm sorry, yes. It doesn't know anything since past 2021. If you've experimented with it, it's okay, and there's some use for it. But if you start asking it to write in depth, it doesn't make any sense, a lot of it. So experiment with it. Don't be afraid of it. Experiment and see what it can do. I don't think it will ever replace the human mind. I mean, it's getting better. They're refining it. It reminds me of when digital photography came on the scene. People were, it'll never replace film. Well, guess what? Because it's gotten so good, you can't tell anymore. So I think generative AI is headed in that direction. In terms of the legal and ethical issues, that's what's being debated. And Europe is way ahead of the US on this. They have really taken this to heart. They are creating laws. They're not there yet, but they're going to be way ahead of us. The US, we're just starting to look at it.
So it's a good thing you mentioned that. Just last week, we put up a podcast. I interviewed Eva Karasen, who is the chief legal counsel at NNG in Budapest. Mm-hmm. And she is very on top of the EU AI Act
Yep.
Almost the whole podcast was about the EU AI Act and how it's affecting US businesses as well.
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to throw out to our listeners, it's a great podcast to listen to have an understanding of what the EU is doing. Now, be mindful that while they've passed this act, there are many critics of it as well, and there are challenges to it. So it's definitely, when we say emerging,
well, and
emerging.
The tech industry is calling for regulation on this. I find it ironic that a couple of months ago on 60 Minutes, the head of OpenAI, who created ChatGPT, said it scared him. Well, the time to be afraid of the bears before you let them in the house. But the tech industry understands that, hey, this thing could get out of hand. But again, I come back to it's a tool. You can't blame the technology. There will be good actors and bad actors with it. The trick we have to do is maintain or increase our transparency.
Absolutely.
When is generative AI being used? And tell your audiences, your stakeholders, when it's being used. And because the risk of greater disinformation, I think we're going to see it in the 2024 elections and beyond. I believe this stuff has got to be regulated. The question, of course, with regulation, as always, is who does the regulating?
Right.
We've seen lots and lots of examples of industries, quote, regulating themselves, and that doesn't always turn out well. But then do you want more government regulation, and who's writing the legislation? Because honestly, if you look at, not to be ageist, but a lot of our elected representatives aren't as familiar with the technology.
Not at all.
And they have to get up to speed on this. And they need to understand what are the ethical, what are the legal issues. None of these laws have been written yet. The courts are still looking at, or just starting to look at this stuff. And Gina, the law has a process time. It doesn't move quickly. Meanwhile, the technology is accelerating.
Well, I'll share with you and our listeners at Gina Rubel, we have a generative AI resource center on our website where we're updating content daily. There's major things happening every single day, as you know. And we also have a sample generative AI use policy, because there's a lot of companies out there that are not, they're saying, and I agree with you, these are tools to use and to play with, but companies also need to protect themselves and understand how they can be used in a way that's safer for their employees and any confidential information they might have. So you can't just go and input any kind of prompt and say, oh, this is fine. ChatGPT's already been hacked.
Right.
At least once.
Right.
In fact, I read an article today, which I found interesting. It's called Poison GPT, and it's all about how they're poisoning the large language model systems. It's above my pay grade, frankly. It's something that our chief innovation officer shared with me, sent it to our IT company and said, are we protected? Are we doing all the right things? Because it's just so big.
Well, let me simplify it for your audience. All what we're talking about, all this stuff, it's just math. That's all it is.
Yes.
It's really complicated, sophisticated math that hurts my brain, but it's only math. That's all this is. And, generative AI is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, but there's other emerging technologies that are impacting us too. Virtual reality, augmented reality, geofencing, metaverse, it depends. That's seems to be fading. But, for communicators, virtual reality, augmented reality, it's here. This stuff is here. There's not necessarily a reason, or won't be a reason, to hold a press conference live anymore, in person. Everybody can slip on their goggles, and the CEO or the spokesperson sits in their office or wherever their place is, and you conduct a virtual press conference, a virtual town hall for locations scattered across the country or across the region.
Interesting. Now, and I have to play with that idea for a second. I haven't thought about it from a VR perspective.
Yeah.
We've done virtual press conferences ever since the pandemic started.
Right.
In fact, most of them are virtual now.
Right. Of course.
Are you seeing that as the future trend?
I think it's going to be part of it. Again, it's a tool. It's another tool in our toolbox. And if it makes sense to use in a particular circumstances, then by all means use it. But it's not for everything, and it's not for everyone. I mean, I think to me, that's the exciting part. All these tools are coming online. They're being revised. They're getting better and better. And then it's up to us to say, okay, where does this make sense to use? It may make perfect sense to use in a town hall meeting and not with the media. That's okay. That's fine. We're all experimenting. Nobody has an answer to any of this stuff yet. But I think we need to, as communicators, we need to own this stuff. Don't let, with all due respect to IT, don't let IT own this. Don't let marketing own this, because it will be used for their purposes, which is fine. I totally get it, but it's a communications tool. And don't let consultants come in and own this, or consulting companies. We have to be fluent enough in this stuff on what it is, keep up with the developments, which is hard, understand the restrictions. A lot of time it's resources, but how else can we advise our clients and our C-suite if we're not familiar with this?
I couldn't agree more. And what I want to repeat that I hear you saying is the public relations professionals must be on top of
Absolutely.
emerging technologies. I agree 1,000 times over.
Yeah.
We have to.
We have to. And I did a research study earlier this year, the one that you referenced, presented at the IPR in DC, where we started out looking at the teaching of emerging technologies on the college level. But what we found, we went after 3 different audiences: students, college professors, and the industry. And we found the industry is, in some cases, quietly dipping their toe in it. Certainly in the in-house side, the agencies are a little more aggressive by and large, because they see this as a value-added service they can offer their clients. But they're still learning what this stuff is. The students on the other end are enthusiastic about this stuff. They want to, because they're tech savvy and they want to know. So the nexus falls on us, the instructors, to instruct them not just how to use it, but as you mentioned, and as we talked about earlier, the ethical, legal ramifications of using it. Because when they graduate college, those are the ones who are going to help train the older generation on how to use this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there is a kind of a direct through line, direct connection in that 3-legged stool. So it behooves us to be up on this stuff. And, as simple as, one of the findings we suggested was, hey, college professors, find internships for this stuff. Trust me, students will grab it. But that generation is going to teach an older generation how to use these emerging technologies. And then it's up to the older generation to figure out, okay, strategically, how do we use this stuff?
Absolutely. So let's round out the conversation since we're almost out of time. If you can tell any listener the one most important thing about social advocacy and activism in terms of getting started, what would it be?
Good question. I think you've got to start with the research. You've got to talk to your internal and external stakeholders, find out what is important to them. If you already are doing this stuff, revisit it. Are you doing it as well as you could be doing it? Are there other issues maybe you should be addressing, other issues that maybe don't fit anymore with your business model? And keep up on what's going on. I mean, that's what good leaders do anyway. But this stuff is just moving so fast. And try as much as possible, to anticipate what is going to be the next big thing. I don't have a crystal ball either. But again, referencing, the upcoming presidential elections, stances on issues is part of the campaign, on whatever political side you're on. This stuff is not going away. It's going to be more and more part of the C-suite and communicators' portfolio in the next 5 years. Research bears that out. This stuff is going to be a bigger and bigger piece of, companies' culture and organizations' culture.
So what are some of your favorite resources for staying on top of what is going on?
Well, I think the Institute for PR does a lot of research on this stuff. USC Annenberg publishes a study every year on trends going on in the world of public communication. The Planck Center at the University of Alabama does some of this work. There are some other, University of Florida. I have a good friend who is really probably the foremost expert in the country on this stuff. So the resources are out there. Again, it takes time, and there's only 24 hours in a day. But again, it's here to stay. That's really my belief. This is going to become more and more important, especially as the new generations enter the workforce.
I agree. And I have to say kudos to Temple, which is really known as one of the best communications universities in the US and in Pennsylvania. They have such great resources. I'm glad that they have you. I've hired people right out of school from Temple. So I've been a guest speaker in some of the classes over the years. And I just have to say that I hope that if you're listening to this, make sure that you take a look at those resources that Gregg has shared. I asked that question for a reason.
Thank you for the kind words.
Well, with that, Gregg, we'll have your contact information in the show notes.
Right.
And it's been an absolute pleasure to catch up with you again. It's been too long.
So great to see you again, Gina.
All right, listeners, thank you so much for joining us here today. I do want to give a quick shout out to our producers, Jennifer Simpson-Carr and Matthew Henderson, who work very hard to bring this great show to you. So thank you to them, and we look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you for listening to On Record PR. Visit our website, onrecordpr.com, to subscribe to the show, share it with your friends on social media, find show notes, additional episodes, and more information. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, feel free to send us questions or show ideas at podcast@onrecordpr.com.